Hey, so welcome back to the next installment of Idea Chats. Today I have with me Lachlan Salt. Welcome, Lachlan. Um,
Hello.
I, I would first like to begin with acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land I am on today, the Boonwurrung and the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. And I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and I'd like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person watching today. I would also like to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So, Lachlan, thank you for joining me today, especially on a Friday afternoon. I know you're probably wanting to get out of work quite quickly. But I just thought if you could just give us like a bit of detail about you before we get into the questions, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Lachlan Salt. My pronouns are he, they. At the moment, I'm also streaming from Wurundjeri country. So I'm an accountant by qualification. Currently, I'm the CFO at We Are Best, which is an interdisciplinary design and architecture practice. We're based in Naarm, Melbourne. Throughout my career, I've worked across a number of different industries and sectors, mostly for multinational and global organizations, namely in scientific services and oil and gas. I also work with several nonprofit organizations, which are geared towards the LGBTQIA+ communities and also in anti-racism. I'm very much of the strong belief that education around finance can be key in breaking down accessibility and inclusion barriers, especially for marginalised peoples. So most of my work in this space focuses on financial literacy. And a huge driver of that for me is that I'm the child of immigrants, and I feel this is my way of giving back to the communities that raised me.
Lovely. Okay, cool. So, as you may have seen with my interviews, I like to do 5 questions that are just like get to know you questions, and then 5 questions that are around the topic. So the topic we're discussing today is the pay gap, not just the gender pay gap, the pay gap in general. But we'll get to that in a minute. So, question number 1, what is your ideal holiday destination?
Oh, good question. I would have to say Samoa. Being of Polynesian descent myself, my heart's always in the islands, I think.
Cute. When was the last time you went?
For a long time it was 2012, but then I also went back in 2016 as well.
Oh, nice. Cute.
So it's been a little while, but I mean, that's COVID, right?
Yeah. Question number 2, what is a little known fact about you?
Well, I'm not sure if this is little known. I think all of my inner circle know this quite well, but I speak 5 languages fluently.
And what are they?
So German, Samoan, German, Samoan, Japanese, French, and French, sorry.
And English sometimes,
And, well,
apparently.
English sometimes. Not right now.
Not right now, though. Okay, so number 3, if you could have dinner with anybody, dead or alive, who would it be?
My answer to this question is always the same: Maya Angelou.
Okay, cute. Yeah. I'd be terrified to talk to her though.
Oh, I know, me too, but
Like,
so
I'd be like, oh, so eloquent comparatively. Oh my God.
Absolutely. I feel like once we started talking, we wouldn't stop.
Yeah, true. Yeah, I'd just be worried I'd swear too much and be like, I'm so sorry. Okay, question number 4. What is your favorite color?
Emerald green.
Oh, quite specific. Why emerald green?
I don't know. I've just always had an affinity to it. But I mean, potentially being an accountant, green, money, who knows? It was destined from when I was born.
Hey, only one of our money's green, right?
Yeah, but it's the biggest one.
True. I had to think about it then because I haven't seen one in a very, very long time. Okay, so question number 5. If you weren't doing what you are now, what do you think you would be doing?
I always wanted to be an anthropologist or to work in linguistics. It's
Okay.
always been a little hobby or a passion of mine.
And so anthropology in what aspect?
Probably cultural anthropology or internal linguistic reconstruction. I find that really fascinating.
I will pretend to know what that means, sure. Okay, so now for the more hard-hitting questions. So question number 6. So in your role over the years, what has been the industry with the biggest pay gaps? So obviously, I'm not asking you to talk about specific places you have worked, because we all know that NDAs do exist and we can get in lots of trouble. But just generally, like, what sort of industry do you think is worse off?
Definitely. Look, being an accountant, I am generally privy to salary information. So I have seen quite a lot in my time. Speaking from my own lived experience, I'd say construction and scientific and technical services tend to be, from what I've seen, tend to have the largest pay gaps.
Yeah. And so in terms of scientific and technical services, so like what I'm working in with STEM, like reading up about that, I think that was the scariest thing. It's like it's almost double the national average in
Yes,
STEM.
absolutely.
Looking at gender, it is quite difficult when discussing pay gaps to find any information on anything other than gender, especially in
Absolutely.
Australia. Like you and I have had a conversation about like I wanted to look at like racial pay gaps, and trying to find that information is near impossible, which is quite disturbing. But even then, looking at like LGBTQIA plus or disability pay gaps, like there's just a lack of knowledge around it.
Absolutely. I think what that really speaks to is a collection of data and how that data is used as well. I think reporting structures are changing. I think we're seeing that a lot, especially with over recent years with benchmarking in the industry, especially around being culturally and linguistically diverse, being a person of color, being First Nations or Indigenous, and a lot of it is self-reported as well. So there's inconsistencies in data as well.
Yeah, and you can always make statistics say whatever you want, really, can't you?
Absolutely. Counting, right?
Yeah. Okay, so number 7. So, as someone who deals with finance and employment, what would you say is one of the biggest contributors to pay gaps?
Quite simply, I think it's accessibility and flexibility, or
Yep.
rather, a lack thereof.
In terms of, so like when looking at, like, I'll just keep going back to gender because once again, as I said, it's the easiest thing to sort of discuss and also for a lot of people to understand. So a lot of the time when looking at gendered pay gap, the conversation is also not just around how much people get paid, but how they are employed.
Absolutely.
So like traditionally it's sort of more common for females to be in part-time roles. Is that one of the contributors that sort of you see? So it's not just the financial, it's also how employment operates.
Well, that's exactly right. I think it's about the organizational structures and the processes that lead to inflexibility and accessibility as a result of that.
Yeah. Okay. Question number 8. Oh, so this is this is what we were just talking about. So when the pay gap is discussed, it is usually centered around gender. Why do you think other factors aren't discussed as readily?
Well, I think following on from what we were saying before about reporting mechanisms, etc., I think there's a larger conversation to be had. I think collectively, people are still reluctant to discuss racism, homophobia, transphobia. From a penal sense, we're not actually that far removed from a time where we could be actively prosecuted for our identities. Like keeping in mind that Tasmania was the last jurisdiction in so-called Australia to decriminalise homosexuality, and that was in 1997.
Yeah.
It's also an incredibly complex and nuanced issue when it comes down to intersectionality, especially on a societal scale. I think it still terrifies the vast majority of people. Like we're not. I just don't think that we're able to yet sit in our discomfort and navigate those uncomfortable conversations that need to be had in order to facilitate that change.
Yeah. I think it is quite an interesting thing, like, because I've had numerous conversations around like a lot of people just focus on gender when they're talking about diversity and inclusion. And it's like that's something that people can understand right now. Like,
Absolutely.
yes, the next sort of question is LGBTQIA plus or racial or ethnicity based diversity. But what I find at the moment, a lot of people are discussing about intersectionality and trying to fit it in to the sort of the binaries that we look at when we usually discuss these things, whereas it's like that does not work.
Absolutely not.
And
I
I
couldn't
think
agree
that's what,
more.
yeah, what's quite difficult is like a lot of people will throw around intersectionalities expecting that like, oh, you've got this big group over here that's like a queer brown woman. And so that's like they're all the same. And it's like, no.
Absolutely not. I mean, as I said before, it's a lot more nuanced and
Yeah.
complex.
And I think that's the thing, like people aren't ready to delve into it enough to sort of answer those questions, or even to understand what it is the questions are that need to be asked.
That's exactly it.
Like,
I couldn't agree more with that.
yeah. Like, I also think that, okay, so look at our most recent census that happened 2 years ago.
Yep, I think
Yeah.
so.
So I guess it's also then how people are looking at what they're reporting. Do you know what I mean? So if a company is mainly focused on getting their gender equality up to a certain point, they're not going to necessarily worry about others. So maybe that's why the information is lacking.
Well, that's it. I think collection of data for the sake of collection of data is one thing, but it's the intent behind why you're collecting that data and what you intend to do with it.
Yeah.
I always ask myself, like, especially working in accounting, what is my why for doing this? Like, there needs to be a purpose behind it. And that purpose, if it's not fully understood, then the data collection exercise is not necessarily going to yield the best results.
But on the flip side of that, if you don't ask the question, you don't have to answer it.
That's very valid.
Like when the census came out, one of my friends was like, oh, the reason that there's limited LGBTQIA plus questions is because obviously the census informs how budgets work, and therefore if you don't have that, you don't have to worry about it. And that's what's sort of sometimes terrifying. Like if you're not actually saying like that your pay within a company is equal between people of different races, or even asking that question, then you don't have to report it.
That's exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so question 9. So when examining the gender pay gap, a lot of people attribute it to the fact that women tend not to ask for more money or promotions. However, this obviously puts the onus back on women. So as a business, not necessarily your own, but how can companies create better equality within their pays?
Absolutely. I think you raise a valid point, firstly, around putting the onus back on women. I can't speak to that. That is not my lived experience. However, from a business and commercial perspective, so taking where I work at the moment, for instance, we have an incredibly diverse workforce, very inclusive as well. Many of our employees identify as queer, culturally and linguistically diverse, and our gender ratios far surpass industry benchmarks. Even our shareholders and senior leadership team are female and or LGBTQIA+, which is quite fantastic. It's a great place. We approach equality and equity in that respect by valuing skills, responsibilities, working conditions, etc. for each job, even where the work itself may be different. And then remunerating employees accordingly, as opposed to using various other mechanisms. However, as we mentioned earlier, that's only part of the picture. There's far more to the issue than just the actual payment or the actual salary itself.
Yeah.
It's also imperative that the organizational structures and processes don't impede accessibility to things like promotions, flexible working arrangements, training, upskilling, and so on and so forth.
It was actually quite interesting. I was just having a conversation just before this meeting, even about it'd be interesting for us to see with students going on conferences, etc., whether that in itself has a gender disparity. So it's not necessarily what you get paid to do, but what opportunities are open to you to hypothetically then possibly put you up on a next level. Like there is so many things that this conversation goes into that it like I'm trying to keep it surface so we don't run into like 5 hours worth of a conversation.
Of course.
I think it's like because when I discuss this with other people, I've heard quite a lot of people say, "Oh, well, traditionally women don't put their hand up for a raise, or women are less likely to go for a promotion unless they tick 100% of or 80% of sort of the requirements." And I think that's one of those things of like, even if that is the case, why is that then their responsibility? Like, what is it that as a company that you can do to like mitigate those factors and limit the amount of sort of personal pressure someone has to put on themselves to ask for a raise or to like try and go for a promotion? Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. Look, in my experience, having led teams all throughout my career, I feel the onus is really on me as either a manager or a director or in whatever capacity that I am leading a team to really check in with each employee individually and ensure that everybody is being offered the same opportunities. Well, it's not even necessarily the same opportunities, but genuine opportunities for progression and advancement. I really don't prescribe to the old school way of thinking that it's you're promoted based on seniority or you're promoted based on outdated metrics. I really have never prescribed to that. For me, it's all about upskilling. And I mean, I always take it as a great compliment when an employee moves on or moves up or, even surpasses myself, because that means I've done something right as a leader.
Yeah.
And I think in these situations, it really does come back to being able to effectively lead a team and ensure you're checking in with people one-on-one.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, like over the last sort of few years, the concept and the conversation around inclusive leadership has become vastly more important. And I think that's sort of where it does come in, where people are being asked to not just be leaders to people who they recognize themselves in. And I think for years that's what it was. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Absolutely.
you would see someone who went to the same school as you, and so therefore you're like, oh, I know how they work because they were taught the same way I was, and so therefore, like, I'm going to put them up for a promotion because I know hypothetically what they've learned. But just because you've done the same thing or have the same background does not mean that they're the same person as you or even have the same ability.
Absolutely. I actually, funnily enough, this ties into one of your earlier questions about who would have dinner with.
Yeah.
Maya Angelou. There's actually a quote by Maya Angelou that I absolutely love and have always lived by. And I'm going to be paraphrasing here, so I'm sorry if I butcher it. But it's along the lines of, we allow our ignorance to prevail upon us and allow us to think that we can survive alone in groups, alone in patches, alone in races, even alone in genders. And so, again, I probably did butcher that. However, the sentiment remains the same. And it really is that idea that not branching outside of a particular group in society is, it's safe, it's comfortable because it's something you know. But realistically, like I really believe that dynamic leadership and dynamic teams and effective teams come where there are many different approaches and many different lived experiences and backgrounds and walks of life. And that really is what inclusivity is about to me.
Yeah. Cute. Thank you for the quote. I'll have to look it up to see how much you butchered it.
Yeah, no worries. I'm pretty sure it was okay because I
Yeah.
was in. I actually use that as my year 12 high school yearbook quote.
Oh, cute. Okay, and so question number 10. What is your advice to someone who thinks they are getting underpaid due to their demographic?
Discuss your salary with your peers and your colleagues. I think there is great transparency, great power in transparency and knowledge, which fosters employer accountability. Confidentiality around salary only empowers employers. That's as simple as that. I mean,
Yeah.
there is obviously far more to it, but I think discussing salary is the first way to really break down those barriers.
Well, I remember a few years ago I was working somewhere and I was looking to apply for a job that was actually above someone that I was working with. And I was just like, oh, what, like, can I know what you're getting paid so I can have a rough idea of what, like, I will be getting paid? And they just were like, oh, no, sorry, I don't talk about finances. And I found that really odd
I find that
because
so strange.
it's one of those things of like, I remember being in other businesses where you're like, oh, this is what I'm getting paid. And it's so important to talk about because there were times when I was getting paid like far less than what I should have been, but I would not have known unless I'd asked the question.
Of course.
And I think that's what is quite difficult because, as you said, like without transparency, how can a business be held accountable?
Correct.
And the sort of rhetoric from majority of senior leadership is like, do not discuss your pay.
Of course.
And it's sort of like, well, why? Like, what are you hiding?
Absolutely. And it's just transparency. And
Yeah.
that's where the power comes into it. Then you have bargaining power, then you have the ability to open that dialogue and have that conversation.
Like when I was discussing this with someone else, I found it quite funny that there might have been a bit of naivety in my head because I was like, unlike a lot of things within diversity and inclusion, like the gender pay gap is, yeah, with like that is quite simple. It's sort of like if you hire two people for the same role, just pay them the same.
Absolutely.
Like it is something that is tangibly able to be fixed.
That's exactly, as I was
Which,
saying earlier, it's really about valuing the skill set. It's about
yeah,
valuing the duties that are being performed, etc. I mean, in my mind, that just seems logical. I'm not
yeah.
sure if it's accountant brain or what.
But so then the person I was talking to was like, yes, but you've got to remember that a business will always pay someone the least that they have to,
Absolutely.
which is really depressing when you think about it. But it is quite nice that like there's someone that I follow on Instagram who I think I've talked to you about him before, where during COVID he cut his CEO's salary to like a tenth of what it was or whatever, and then is able to pay all of his, this is in America, all of his employees a base rate of $75,000 a year. And so in a time where the majority of America is like, oh, we're having a people, what's the word? People crisis.
Oh, yes, of course. Employee shortage.
Yeah. People crisis. He's like, every time we apply, like put out a job, we get so many applicants because we're paying people a decent wage. And I think
Absolutely.
that's what's quite interesting when you sort of look at it that way, and then also look at what gender disparity there is. And it's sort of like, well, is that where an issue is that a lot of the time, how to say this, like what's sort of attributed to roles that are traditionally seen as female, not that I like talking about roles in a binary, but just for general terminology, tend to be paid less. And so that's where women sit there and then men sit there. Like it's such a difficult conversation that can be never ending, like in reality.
Absolutely.
But yeah, otherwise, in terms of places, so if someone does think that they are getting paid less because of based on what their demographics are, would the best place to be Fair Work?
Yes, generally would be that. Well, I mean, naturally opening up the conversation with your employer firstly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if that is fruitless, then yes, absolutely Fair Work. Fair Work is like a phenomenal resource. I mean, especially in industries that are governed by awards, for instance.
Yeah.
That that is something that I do think that we do quite well as opposed to other countries. The system's not perfect, absolutely not, but that information is transparent and it's publicly available and quite easily accessible as well. But Fair Work will always point you in the right direction. Like they are quite helpful in that respect. And there's nothing that they dislike more than being people being unfairly treated.
Okay, cute. Well, thank you very much for joining me today, Lachlan. It's been lovely.
Me.
And thank you all for joining us again for this installment of Idea Chats. Next month, we'll be discussing another D&I topic. All right, thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.